Swampert is the strongest release to date for a berry specialist. Now I know we just talked about Sceptile, and Sceptile is still the current berry king. But the problem is you can't compare Swampert to Sceptile directly because Swampert's skill is an indirect strength provision to Snorlax via dish making. And with the right usage of Tasty Chance S, the same way you would use Dedenne or maybe even Cramorant or Weavile, with the right strategy to use Tasty Chance S, you will get the most value out of it. But Swampert simply beats Weavile anyway while being cheaper to catch, easier to farm candies. It can evolve twice, giving you free main skill level 3 if you catch it as a Mudkip, and it completely whacks Marowak off the map in terms of berry production, making it the best ground berry specialist at the same time as well. The main downside of Swampert is yes, it has Tasty Chance S, but it won't trigger as fast as Dedenne or as much as Dedenne, and it can't double bank like Dedenne. So if you're banking on one really strong dish like Monday breakfast, which you've expanded pot from the Sunday prior and you've done all this prep with tails as your extra ingredients, then running Dedenne would make more sense to get you more triggers before cooking that powerful meal. But do we actually need double banking considering that Tasty Chance S is strongest for its first trigger and then it has diminishing returns? So the second trigger in a double bank actually isn't worth that much, which we'll cover again in a moment. But otherwise, Swampert is a really good option for day-to-day use and also even sleeping overnight because of the berry production from its berry specialty. That was a really long introduction to Swampert and how good it can be, but you gotta use it right. Welcome back to another Pokemon Sleep video, it's Bro Vinny here. Let's take a look at Swampert's stats. It's a berry specialist, it has Tasty Chance S skill. Once again, with Tasty Chance, it's not often about how much it triggers, it's actually about whether this skill exists at all. Let's talk about that again, but I actually covered this in my Dedenne video about Tasty Chance S. If you want a more in-depth understanding, go watch my Tasty Chance S video. It has a low ingredient rate, 15%, good for a berry specialist, but its speed isn't crazy like Sceptile. Overall though, it still works out to be a reasonable berry specialist, which we'll take a look in a moment. It farms corn as its base ingredient, and there's not a lot of Pokemon that farm corn as a base ingredient, so it's good to see some variety. Our first comparison is a simple one. Swampert versus Marowak, our previous ground berry specialist. And Swampert beats it by 35% in berry output, completely dominating ground berries. Even its ingredient strength is better than Marowak. The only advantage of running Marowak is if for whatever reason your team is running really low on energy, you might swap out Swampert for a Marowak because it has a self-healing ability. But otherwise, Tasty Chance S is just going to be a much more powerful skill, especially if you're cooking stronger dishes, which we'll cover in a moment. Let's finish looking at berry outputs first. Next, how about other favorite berries at Type Holo? Type Holo is fire, rock, and ground types for favorite berries. So there were always other options instead of using Marowak. Compared to Typhlosion and Onyx, Swampert actually farms less berry strength. Now for Onyx, I did give it a 2000 hour sleep ribbon. Without the ribbon, Onyx would be the worst in berry output of the three. With the ribbon, Swampert comes out at the bottom, but not by much. We're talking about a 5% improvement with using Typhlosion over Swampert, purely looking at the berry output. I think by and large, Swampert's release has brought the ground berry game to the level of fire berries, because ground berries were previously marred by Marowak. Now Typhlosion does have Chance Strength as its skill, and I've given all of these Pokemon max skill level, and in 24 hours it farms about 14,000 strength in this setup. But Tasty Chance S is not simple to evaluate how strong it is. Although what I want to do is first compare to Sceptile, our new berry king. So here I've got no favorite berries matched. I want to see what happens if we put Sceptile into the picture as well. And that's considering non-favorite berries. If it's favorite, this number goes up by quite a lot, in fact double. The question is, how do we now value Tasty Chance S compared to, say, currently the strongest berry specialist, excluding legendaries, that is Sceptile with its berry burst? If you had the choice, should you catch a mudkip or a trico first? Well, ideally you get both. What we'll want to do now is look at Tasty Chance S. Tasty Chance S gives you 10% extra crit rate on your dishes at level 6, and that's what we'll analyze for the rest of this video at level 6. If you find that Tasty Chance S is too hard to understand, take this point home. There's only one thing you really need to know is that Tasty Chance, a single level 6 trigger, the 10% boost in crit chance, gives you a strength equal to 50% more dish strength. But any subsequent triggers that you keep stacking on top of the initial 10% you got will give you a diminished amount of strength by a lot. We're talking about from a second trigger only brings it up to about 67%. So the trick to maximize the value of Tasty Chance is to have it trigger once and then swap out that Pokemon, have someone else come in to do whatever else you need, maybe farm ingredients or expand pot. Then after the crit has happened, bring back your Tasty Chance Pokemon to trigger again. Each one is worth nearly 50% subsequent to that. Now it does depend on how many meals remaining in the week. But for a simple understanding, 50% for one trigger, swap out that Pokemon no matter whether it's Swampert, Dedenne, Weavile. That's how you get the most value out of Tasty Chance S. How did I get 50%? Well, just watch my video on Tasty Chance and you'll see that if you have 21 meals remaining in the week, a single trigger of Tasty Chance provides you 50% of dish strength. Trigger one extra time will only bring it up to 67%. If you trigger 7 times, it only brings your value up to 87%. So that means it took you 7 triggers just to get 87% more dish strength. And I should clarify, this 50% is of a single dish, not your entire week of meals, because we're comparing how much strength is provided by a single Tasty Chance S trigger so that we can put some value down here to compare with other Pokemon. At maximum potential, let's have a look at the current strongest dish, which is Clodsire Eclair at level 65. It farms 69,756 strength before adjusting for area bonus and ignoring any extra ingredients you put in. Even better if you put in a bunch of tails. But let's use this number first. Let's estimate that as about 70,000. 50% of 70,000 is 35,000. Which means a single trigger, doesn't matter which Pokemon it's coming from, a single trigger gives you 35,000 strength if you're only cooking Clodsire Eclair for the entire week. So that means the requirement is that you're gonna have to have good ingredient specialists to farm you those ingredients quicker, and a good expand pot or run good camp tickets so that you don't have to run expand pot to make this 35,000 a realistic number. But the reason I have Sceptile here is to compare what 35,000 means. A single trigger of Tasty Chance S, it can be from Swampert, Dedenne or Weavile, doesn't really matter, beats the entire trigger in 24 hours of Sceptile. Where this falls through though is that if you're unable to cook the best dishes, or you start to stack multiple Tasty Chance S, then the value starts to diminish. So let's say we've got about 3 triggers from Swampert. 3 triggers, let's say it happened before you cooked any dishes for the week, will give you 75% dish strength. So 75% of Clodsire Eclair works out to be about 53,000. So the 3 triggers of Swampert, if used at the start of the week, is worth about 53,000, which is still much better than Sceptile. In fact, it's much better than Sceptile. The problem is each additional trigger isn't giving you a whole lot more. You'd hope that 3 triggers gives you 35,000 times 3, but it doesn't. Unless your strategy is to have Tasty Chance S trigger once, rotate out that Pokemon, have other Pokemon come in and farm berries, ingredients, expand pot, whatever it is. Then once a crit has happened and the Tasty Chance has reset to 0, then you bring back the Tasty Chance Pokemon to trigger again. Then we can think of the value as 50% each time that it happens. Although you should know that the less meals remaining you have, so let's say you're much further into the week, you've only got a few meals left, then the value is diminished. Now, one thing about this table is that I did not account for the 3 times Sunday power. which would make this even stronger. So this is just a way to understand Tasty Chance is not an accurate representation of what actually happens. The problem of Sunday is that it way overvalues Tasty Chance because while it is super powerful to have 3 times the dish power, which is what happens on Sunday, making Tasty Chance S even stronger, the fact that there's only 1 day left of the week means that the value is greatly diminished. We want those Tasty Chance S earlier in the week if you want to power up all your sessions throughout the week, not just the final session. And the final catch to this analysis is that of course you're gonna have to have a high recipe level. At low recipe level, let's say at level 1, only 20,000 strength with Clodsire Eclair, 50% of that is just 10,000 strength. It's not that good. But having said that, I wouldn't mind getting crits earlier on in this dish level as well, because if you think about it, you're just leveling up that dish quicker to get to that level 65. So here we have a skill that is not only powering up Snorlax, but also leveling up something, your dish level. And I didn't even put a value to how good that is in terms of how the skill can level up your dishes quicker. So that's a hidden benefit. So I hope I convinced you that Tasty Chance S is extremely powerful. I can see Swampert's potential being much higher than Sceptile. Its ceiling is much higher in terms of strength production. You just need to know when to rotate out your Swampert. And I'd say 1 or 2 triggers, it's time to swap out Swampert because its Tasty Chance is just not providing you with that much more strength. The only catch is if you're trying to cook a very powerful dish, let's say a hugely expanded dish, first meal of the week and you're gonna dump all of your tails, then of course you want more Tasty Chance to trigger before you do that. But in that case, the Dene will shine because it has a higher trigger rate, so you're gonna get those triggers a bit earlier. So how does Swampert compare to other Pokemon of Tasty Chance? Let's take a look. The only other berry specialist, same as Swampert, that has Tasty Chance is Weavile. Swampert makes 47% more triggers than Weavile during daytime, which is crazy considering that otherwise they have about the same berry output and it looks like Swampert has a little bit more. So while Weavile or even Sneasel are significantly more expensive to catch, we're talking about 16 to 20 pips in order to catch one of them, and the fact that you need a Razor Claw to evolve Sneasel, it makes absolutely no sense to hunt Sneasel Weavile at all after the release of Swampert. Mudkip is so cheap to catch by comparison and it does the job better. The only reason you might use Weavile over Swampert is maybe if it's Dark favorite berry, but even then you're gonna have to invest more main skill seeds compared to Swampert, and there's just a lot of cost involved to use a Weavile. I personally spent a lot of biscuits trying to catch Weavile because at the time without Swampert, it was really good considering Tasty Chance exists as a skill on a berry specialist and Weavile was the only option. But I think I'm just gonna pivot over to Mudkip because I still haven't invested in a Weavile. I never really found an amazing one. I found some decent ones, but I personally never found an amazing one. The other Pokemon that has Tasty Chance S, which is by the way not a skill specialist as well, is Cramorant. Now Cramorant is 18% more triggers than Swampert, but the catch about using an ingredient specialist for a skill is that they don't tend to spend very long on the field. A good ingredient specialist, be it mono or not, is a Pokemon that has things like ingredient finding or speed, helping you farm those ingredients really quickly. You've already got all the oil that you need farming with a really good Cramorant for a few hours, and maybe you've got heaps of extra ingredients already, so you don't really need any excess ingredients to fill the pot either. Not that that should be the goal. And then there's an ingredient bag limit, so you farming an excess amount of oil still doesn't make sense. A really good ingredient specialist stays in your box longer than a really bad one. I hope that makes sense. On the contrary, a really good berry specialist, let's say you've got helping bonus, berry finding, helping speed on a Swampert, you want that thing to stay on the field for longer. So while Cramorant does have a higher trigger rate, you might not see the value of investing your seeds into Tasty Chance, not forgetting that it can't evolve either, so you're spending 5 skill seeds compared to 3 skill seeds on Swampert. I would personally put my main seeds on a Swampert over a Cramorant, just because you're going to see more value returned from using Swampert more often. Especially if you're at a point of the game where you don't have a lot of resources and you need to see a lot of value returned from your investments like main skill seed, Swampert is a good option. But how does Swampert compare to the skill specialist of this skill? And that's Dedenne. Well, Dedenne farms nearly 50% more of this skill than Swampert, which isn't actually that much considering that Swampert more than doubles the berry production on Dedenne. And forget that additional triggers, if you don't rotate out these Pokemon, see diminishing returns. 4 triggers before you cook a Monday morning breakfast isn't that much better than 3 triggers. You're looking at 80% from 4 triggers compared to 75%, so that additional trigger is only a 5% improvement on the strength of a single dish, which is tiny. But of course, if you use it right, if you're rotating out your Dedenne after it's triggered once and then only putting it back in after you've critted, then we can nearly see this as a 50% improvement in skill. So at the end of the day, it's about you using Tasty Chance S properly, and it's less about how many times Tasty Chance S triggers, but whether it even exists at all. The fact that it even exists on a Pokemon for you to trigger even just the one time is worth a lot if used properly. Give them both berry finding, Swampert beats Dedenne by 60% in berry output. And forgetting to log into the game is not as harmful if you're snacking a lot using Swampert, because you just get more berries compared to Dedenne. Yes, it can double bank, but the double banking isn't guaranteed, and once the inventory limit is reached, then it can also have 0 triggers. So let's take a look and see what happens if we do an 8.5 hour of sleep. Well, what is the single versus double trigger rate? Well, of course, only skill specialists can get double triggers. So here we see after 8.5 hours, Dedenne has a 37% chance to trigger one time with neutral stats. Better if you've got skill trigger M or main skill chance up. It has an 18% chance to have a double trigger. But again, double trigger isn't a lot more powerful than a single trigger, back to what we were saying before. Whereas Swampert can only get a single trigger at 42% after an 8.5 hour sleep. Of course, with berry finding, this number does go down, but I didn't put berry finding here just for a fair comparison. If we do give Swampert berry finding for an unfair comparison, we do see that number, the chance to trigger in the morning, go down. So about 1 in 3 nights, we will expect to see Swampert to trigger if you sleep with it. But of course, while you're sleeping with it, it's farming a huge amount of berries because of its sneaky snacking on its ×3 berries with its berry finding. Sleeping with a Dedenne that has skill trigger but not berry finding, well, much less berry output. So there's a huge trade-off here as well. So that also makes Swampert a safer option to use as well overnight in case you don't get the triggers. Yes, of course, Dedenne will have a higher chance to trigger overall, and it has double trigger chance as well. Overall, there's a 50% chance of something triggering in the morning, whereas Swampert only 33% chance, but you are guaranteed the berry output. And of course, once again, Swampert will save you on main skill seeds and biscuits to get a good one, whereas Dedenne is still the expensive option, although not as bad as catching Weavile. And I'm not even sure the trade-off of 1 main seed for Razor's Claw to evolve a Sneasel is worth that 1 main skill level. Regardless, Swampert is just a really great addition to the game, especially for free-to-play players who have not yet gotten a good Dedenne or Sneasel or Cramorant, all being relatively expensive options. So I think Swampert is needed for beginners or veterans. Just make sure you cook as strong a dish as you can all the time when you run Swampert, and swap out the Tasty Chance Pokemon after it's triggered once, so that you can farm other stuff that you need like ingredients, pot, etc. And a good Swampert, even if it's not skill focused, would be worth you spending those 3 main skill seeds. So of the 3 Hoenn starters, which one should you catch first? Well, first of all, look at what berry coverage you're missing. If you're missing grass types, fighting types, ground types, that's probably the one that you should go for first. If you heavily rely on dish cooking and often cook strongest dishes, and you like to maximize your dish making strength, then Mudkip, Swampert is the preferred option. Of course, if you already have a busted Dedenne, then it's less of a priority. Sceptile is a really good berry generalist, so if you already have Tasty Chance covered, then maybe go for Sceptile. In the next video, we're going to look at Plusle and Minun, a totally different discussion to the Hoenn starters. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe.